All right, so I just want to quickly talk a little bit about components and what they are, because they are the foundation of most Angular applications. So it's very important to understand how components work and how they're structured. So Angular apps have a common structure which are made up of a few different entities, including modules and services, but components are the bulk of most applications. When we look at a user interface for any application, we say things like navigation, headers, input boxes, and the list goes on. Well, we can think of these pieces of the UI as their own individual component with their own functionality, okay, with properties and methods. That's what frameworks like Angular are great for. They really organize the code and the application itself. So every Angular component includes a class which can have properties and methods. A method is basically just a function inside of a class. Components also have a template associated with them, which is what the user actually sees in the browser. Okay, and we can bind data from the component class to the template and vice versa. This is what makes Angular so dynamic. So here's an example of what a very simple website or application may look like and how we could break things up into components. Now, most Angular applications will have something called a root app component, and all of the components that we create will be nested inside of that root component. So if we look at this image, we have a navbar and a sidebar component. Then we have a posts component, and notice inside the post component we have post search component, and then each individual post is also its own component. Okay, so we can nest these and we can actually pass data in from one component to another. So you can see that this really helps organize our application UI and its functionality. Alright, so this brings me to why we would want to use components in the first place, as opposed to just looking at a single template with a bunch of unorganized HTML like we used to before frameworks. So obviously organization is at the top. Code organization is very important. It allows us to break up the user interface so that we can encapsulate the functionality with the properties and methods of each component. This also promotes reusability. It stops us from having to repeat ourselves, which is a common struggle in programming, in addition to reusing components in the same application, but you may be able to use them across multiple apps in the future. So breaking things up into components and being more organized does wonders for teamwork. It makes it easy for other programmers to read your code and know exactly what's going on. Angular is being used quite a bit in the business world, small businesses and enterprise level. Alright, so let's take a quick look at the structure of a basic component. And this is actually an example of the root app component. Okay, remember I said that every Angular application has a root app component, and then we create components to nest into that. So even though it's the root app component, it has the same basic layout as any component that we're going to create. So the first line you see here, import component from Angular core, is bringing in the component module from the Angular core package. Now remember when we looked at the package.json file, you saw a bunch of these at Angular / something. So Angular is made up of all these different packages, and the component part of it, the component module, comes from the core package. So we need to be sure to bring that in. Okay, now all a component really is a class with properties and methods. So I'm going to skip this part for a second and notice that we have a class called app component. Okay, and inside here we have one property called name, and it's set to a string of Angular. Now, in addition to the class, we have something called a decorator. That's what this at component thing is. This is a decorator that can add metadata or special information to your component, and this is part of TypeScript. Okay, so selector is one of the parts that is added, and this has to do with what is going to be displayed in the tag inside of the HTML or inside of the template to display your component. Now take a minute to look down here at this part, which is the actual HTML, and you'll notice that we have this tag here. This is a special directive, and it says my-app. So this is the same as the selector. So that's how it knows to display this component here. So what is it going to display here? It's going to display the template, okay, which is part of the decorator. And this particular template is just an H1, and it says hello, and then we have these two curly braces here with name in the middle. So this name is actually this name property. Okay, so we can access properties in the class from our template using something called string interpolation, and that's what this is right here. And I'm going to get into this much more in a little bit, in a couple lectures from now. But we can access our properties from here. We can access methods, and we can bind data. We can do all types of things that relate the class to the template. Okay, so if we were to look at this component in the browser, it would just say hello Angular, okay, because name is actually, the property is equal to Angular. So hopefully that makes sense as far as the basic structure. We have a selector, a template. It's not here, but we can also add CSS, a link to an external CSS file, or we can add inline CSS within the component decorator as well. All right, now, as you saw in one of the last videos where we looked at the file structure, you saw that there was an app component, and it had a bunch of different types of files. It had a TS file, it had something called a spec file, which isn't listed here, but that's for testing. It had an HTML file, a CSS file. So these are all parts of the component. And the HTML is basically the template, the CSS, of course, is the styling, and the TS is the main component. Now, we can create these files on our own, which is what we're going to do at first, but we can also use the CLI to generate components. And we can do that by simply saying ng, or the word generate, and then component, or just C. We can actually do nggc, and then the name of the component. And you can also put it into a certain location. In this particular command, we're putting it into a folder called components, which is what I would recommend to do. I like putting all my components inside of a components folder, and usually in their own folder as well. Okay, not only will this create all three of these files for us, but it will also add the component to the ng module, which we looked at. It'll add it to the declarations so that Angular knows to actually look for that component. All right, but we're going to get into all this. This is just a very basic overview. I don't expect you to understand everything that I just said. So in the next video, we're going to jump in and we're going to start to look at how components are structured within the application, and we're going to create our own component.